Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with ESPN broadcaster and radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals, Dave Pasch, is brought to you in part by Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and you can sponsor a child today. You can release a child from poverty. You can provide food and clothing and education, all done in the name of Jesus. It's the best $38 that the Romano family spends every single month, and I want to encourage you guys to do the same. It's $38, compassion.com/sportspectrum. You change a child's life by sponsoring them through Compassion. So go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. I promise you, you will not regret it. Today's guest on the podcast is Dave Pasch, ESPN broadcaster and radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals. Dave has been a play-by-play voice with the Cardinals since 2002, and he joined ESPN as an announcer in 2003, and he's a graduate from Syracuse University back in 1994. This is a fun podcast because if you know Dave at all, if you've ever watched him broadcast a game, he's got a ton of stories. And one of the great storytellers that Dave works with is a guy named Bill Walton. And Dave and Bill do college basketball broadcasts on ESPN. And Bill Walton's just one of the most unique people I've ever met and worked with. And Dave shares some wonderful stories on this podcast of his time working with Dave and just kind of what type of person Bill Walton is. Maybe the most unique Hall of Famer in any sport that's still alive right now. And it's just a treat to listen to Dave share about stories with Bill. We also talk with him about his journey through Syracuse and following in the footsteps of guys like Marv Albert and Bob Costas and Mike Tirico and Dick Stockton. And then we talk about his faith. Now, Dave grew up in a Jewish home. He grew up Jewish and then converted to Christianity after he met his wife in the mid-'90s. And that story alone is an interesting one to listen to for sure. And Dave just didn't kind of choose Christianity and say, okay, I follow Jesus. Like, he was a skeptic who actually went and did the research and investigated faith and investigated Jesus and whether he was real or not. So this is really a fun conversation. There's a lot going on with Dave, and I think you guys will really enjoy this podcast. So without further ado, let's get right to it. ESPN broadcaster, radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals. This is our conversation with Dave Pasch. Take a listen. Welcome, Dave, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Chase. Appreciate it.
It's good to talk to you, Dave. And let's start off with something fun. Many people know you, obviously, from your work at ESPN, which has you doing college football and college basketball, as well as NBA. And many know you as the guy who works with the Hall of Famer, Bill Walton, on those college basketball broadcasts. Now, I've met Bill, worked with him on a few different occasions. I once had him on for an interview for an ESPN radio show that I produced years ago, about 15 years ago. And the host asked him one question in this interview to open it up. Just one question. It might have just been, Bill, how are you doing? 14 minutes later, he finally finished answering that question, and the interview was over, and we had to go to a break. It was literally one question, how you doing? He's a fascinating guy to me. I wonder where Bill Walton ranks for you on the most interesting people you know scale. Where does he rank for you?
Well, first of all, that story you just told is so shocking. It's so surprising to hear that Bill would be lengthy in an answer, and the actual host wouldn't get back in. He does it all the time. I think he does it just so that they won't ask him any questions, and he could just talk about whatever he wants to talk about. That's the Bill Walton podcast. When he gets asked a question, he just goes on for minutes. But he's without a doubt the most unique Hall of Famer on the planet, and certainly the most interesting individual that I've worked with. It was so funny because my first year on the NBA was 2006, and I remember doing a handful of games with Bill, and obviously knew all about Bill as a player and as a broadcaster growing up, watching him on NBC with Snapper and Tom Hammond. And so I just remember, this guy's contentious. He likes to go at it. He likes to battle. So I was ready, but I wasn't ready. I thought I was ready, but I really wasn't. And there was one game we were doing, I think it was Cleveland at Chicago. he was going to the Final Four the next day. It was like a Saturday game in between, or around the Final Four anyway, or a Friday game maybe. And so he says, I can't remember who, it actually had been LeBron, took his headband or wristband out and kind of threw it toward the scorer's table. And Bill goes off, "That's a technical foul." And he just kept going. And I just let him go. I didn't say anything. I didn't stop him. I just didn't know what to react. I was shocked. And the next week I get a call from Mike Tirico, and Mike says, "Look, you got to stop him. That's your job. You got to jump in there. You can't let him just go on like that." So I kind of hid that in the back of my mind, and you never know where you're going to use that again. And we got paired about 5 or 6 years after that for doing the Pac-12 games in ESPN, and I brought that back up and said, "Okay, stop him. Just stop him." And so I've been able to try to stop him. It's hard to succeed, but at least I've tried.
I always think people who interview Bill Walton on any level, I remember he was on Mike and Mike a couple of years ago when I was working with him. If you can get 3 questions in, you're a professional on the highest level. Just to be able to interject him. Is there a favorite Walton story you can share, or maybe a couple, just on the road with him, what it's like to be around this guy?
Well, I mean, there's so many. We'd be here, we'd take up the entire podcast, and I would be the one talking for 15 minutes without you getting in another question. But, I think just overall, how he goes about his job, people assume, first of all, wrongly, that because Bill doesn't always talk about basketball that he's not prepared. But if you saw his workspace, he's got sheets of paper everywhere with his handwriting on it. So he gets emails, he talks to coaches, he talks to players, he talks to the SID on the phone for an hour and a half, and then talks to him during shoot-around. Every game. And we have Arizona 8 times a year. He'll sit there with Matt Enzer, the SID. He'll call him on the phone every game, hour and a half, shoot around an hour. It's, again, a lot of the questions may not be basketball related, but he's working. But he will not talk to me at all on game day. He does not want to talk to me. He avoids me. He wants everything to be, he told me, Ralph Lawler and I did Clipper games for 13 years. We never said a word to each other on game day. He just wants it to be spontaneous. Save it for the air, he says. Kevin Love came over one time. He was going to sit down with Bill and I, and he started talking about something, and Bill goes, "Kevin, save it for the air." He didn't want to talk to Kevin before he got on the air. So that's one thing that's unique. He just wants everything to be spontaneous, and every now and then he'll, take his headset off and he'll say, "Whatever I say, whatever I do, just know that I love you." That's what he'll say. But don't tell anyone. I guess I just did. But yeah, there's so many stories. It's just watching him interact with the players and other fans that come up to him. I mean, he's priceless.
I remember being at the 2010 NBA Finals, Lakers Celtics, and I was there as a fan. I was a Celtics fan, and we left the Garden after Game 5, and just walking the streets trying to get to our car. It was probably a good mile or so. And there was Walton with his wife just walking through the crowd, just hanging out. Like, he's 7 feet tall, but just like regularly walking through didn't care, didn't have escorts or security. He was just walking through the crowd after the game was over. It just makes me think that this guy is so different and wired differently than maybe any superstar athlete ever, right?
Yeah, he will stay after the game and sign autographs. He tells people, after the game when they come up, right before tip-off even, he'll have people coming up to him and he'll say, "After the game," and he does. He stays the entire time. One of the stories about Bill that is supposedly true because I've talked to Luke about it. I think it was the clinching game of the 1986 championship in the NBA Finals. He was driving Luke and one of his other sons, it might have been Adam, and they got stuck in a traffic jam on the way to the arena. So they left the car. Bill left the car, got the 2 boys, walked to the Garden. And after the game, his car was in his parking spot. So somebody got his car and drove it to the arena and into Bill's parking space. He told that story along with he's told this one many times about Rick Carlisle. After they won the championship, they're all out, and Bill woke up the next morning with a Rick Carlisle shirt on. And then he searched for Rick for weeks to give it back to him. And Rick said that actually one time he was walking in Boston, and all of a sudden this Jeep pulls up, and Bill gets out. "Rick, I have your shirt." So he literally was searching for Rick, because back then you didn't have cell phones. You couldn't text, "Hey, where are you?" He hunted him down and gave him his shirt back.
Oh, again, we could go on all day with Bill Walton. It's such great stories. This is Dave Pasch joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And obviously this is about you as much as it is about Mr. Walton. So let's talk about your story and your career. Go back to your younger days and broadcasting. Was that always a dream for you when you were a kid growing up?
Well, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and back then nobody really knew what the good broadcast schools were, especially if you were living in Wisconsin, because we didn't have social media. The way that I found out that Syracuse had a broadcast school was from watching college basketball on ESPN. I fell in love with Syracuse basketball in the late '80s, watching them on TV in middle school, and then in the '90s when I was in high school, and ended up going to Syracuse in 1990 because I remember Dick Vitale talking about all these announcers who had gone to Syracuse. I wanted to play. I played basketball in high school, played golf, but I wasn't very good. So the next step was, well, how can I stay involved in the sport? And I tried stand-up comedy, and it was terrible. And I said, maybe this is the best way to be involved in the entertainment industry and also stay involved in sports. So I went to Syracuse in the fall of 1990, like many people trying to get involved in broadcasting. I never really had been away from home for an extended period of time, and now I'm going, thousands of miles away. And, Syracuse was the perfect place for somebody wanting to get involved in broadcasting because you were mentored by other students who were older than you, had gone through what you were about to go through. And plus you had all these alumni. When I was there as a freshman, Mike Tirico was working for the local student station. He was only 2 years removed, I think, from school when I was there. Ian Eagle was just a year removed. You still had guys like Sean McDonough, who, Sean, I think, is 10 years older than me, but Sean was doing network games. So he would be doing a Syracuse game, and you were there as a student. So you had access to people that you could talk to and that they were willing to help. And it's a great network there of people that are looking out for others. And plus, just being able to call games there as a student, I just really fell in love with it.
Well, you didn't even mention the legends that have went there, like Marv Albert and Bob Costas, certainly Dick Stockton. I mean, this place has a history, a pedigree, if you will, of people coming through and having success. Tell me about Syracuse, what that time was like for you throughout, and maybe the progression of broadcasting from when you walked in as a freshman to the time you left as a senior.
Yeah, it was, the most embarrassing part of what you have to do to get on the air. First, you have to get on the air doing, just regular sportscasts that you hear on morning radio, for 2 minutes on every station across the country. The next step is, because everybody wants to do this, is play-by-play. And so in order to get cleared by a senior to do play-by-play, you have to do the game on a tape recorder in the stands. Well, where are you sitting in the stands? I mean, it's not like you can just escape at a Syracuse basketball game into a corner. I mean, there's 30,000 people there. So you're in the middle of your buddies sitting there with a microphone and a tape recorder doing the game. So, I mean, it's, pretty embarrassing. You got people staring at you. What's this kid doing? Yeah. But it was good. It kind of, you're going to be talking to people anyway when you're on the air. So you might as well practice with people staring at you. And it was helpful. And then once I got on the air, I felt good. I just had a feel for it. I really loved the play-by-play side of it. But when I left there, I was terrible. I thought I was really good. And I had a guy that I worked, my first job was in Morgantown, West Virginia. And a guy that I worked for, Tony Caridi, is a Syracuse alum. Again, there's the networking. Yep. He had hired Syracuse alums. Dave Ryan, another ESPN alum, was one of them. I think he might have been the first person that Tony hired. And then Dave Jagler, who was the voice of the Washington Nationals, and then I was after Dave. And Tony was hard on me. I mean, he was very hard on me, and it was good. I needed it because, I needed to know, hey, you're not going to go to CBS or ESPN right out of college. You got to work your way up. And so I did that. And, when I went back to Syracuse about 5 years later as their play-by-play guy, I got to call games. They were concerned that because I was replacing somebody who had been there for 2 decades, they were concerned that, there's this 26-year-old kid. Let's have him call games with famous Syracuse alums. that's a way we can endear him to the public. So I got to sit there and I did a game with Marv Albert. I did a game with Marty Glickman, who obviously passed away,
Sure.
Hank Greenwald, and Andy Musser, Costas, Dick Stockton, along with Tirico and McDonough and Ian. I mean, that was a great experience for me, just to kind of watch those guys and how they prepare and how they call a game.
Did you ever find yourself starstruck, even with guys like Marv Albert being there? You ever find yourself starstruck?
It did with Marv. There's no question, because, Marv was my idol growing up, watching him call the NBA Finals and sitting next to him, watching his mannerisms when he calls a game. It was incredible. Yeah, I mean, I remember it to this day. And I also remembered his prep and all of his notes, and they were handwritten. It was the same way that I was doing it. So I kind of felt good about myself. Like, hey, if this is good enough for Marv, then I must be doing okay. So
that's awesome. Well, let's talk about your faith. I know you met your wife. I was reading up and doing a little research, and in '94, you meet your wife, your now wife, who also happened to be someone who talked about Jesus. And that's kind of where this faith turn took. So tell us about growing up, what faith was like, and then that moment when you started to realize, okay, maybe I want to pursue this Jesus guy.
Well, I'm Jewish, so I grew up in a Reform Jewish home, which means you went to temple on the High Holy Days. You pretty much you were going like a Christian or somebody that professed to be a Christian would go to church on Easter and Christmas. So we rarely went. I would say I was an agnostic. I probably drifted in and out of atheism, but primarily an agnostic. I think I believed that there was some sort of power over the universe, but I didn't think about it and I didn't care. And that's kind of how we grew up. I was bar mitzvahed, I was confirmed, studied Hebrew. Went to Hebrew school, all that. But again, it was just because my parents wanted me to. It really wasn't because it was something I was trying to pursue. And then I went to Syracuse and kind of lived like every other kid at Syracuse. And I left Syracuse, graduated in 1994, and said, man, I can't wait to explore the world. I am never getting married. I'm going to go out and do whatever I want. Right. I'm going to pursue broadcasting, and I'm going to just enjoy myself. And the first day, I mentioned I worked in Morgantown, West Virginia for Tony Caridi. The first day, I see this girl walking down the stairs, and I was stunned. I was like, oh, my goodness. I didn't know they had women that looked like this here. And I couldn't remember her name. She told me her name. I walked back upstairs, and back then I had a full head of hair, and I was wearing shorts and flip-flops, so I didn't really take work very seriously, you can imagine. And I walked back into Tony Caridi, and I said, man, I just met the hottest girl I've ever seen in my life, Heidi. And he kind of paused and looked at me like, what is wrong with you? Turns out there's a woman in the office who's named Heidi, who's 75 years old, who worked in accounting. So he thought I was
so good.
He thought I was a little crazy. Her name's Hallie, and obviously I was interested in her. She was dating somebody else at the time, but we became friends. We became very close friends, and I had worked in Morgantown for about 10 months, and about, maybe 8 months later, I said to her, I think I'm going to be getting another job soon. Would you want to come with me? She said, yeah. So
wow, there you go.
We started dating, and as we started dating, there was something different about her. And she started talking about her faith, and she grew up in a Christian home, but the Bible wasn't her authority, she would say. And so I think she was still kind of in a self-discovery position as well, but she would not have any sort of relationship before marriage. And that to me I just hadn't ever thought of that. I was like, why would you do that? Why would you not want to have sex before marriage? And she said, well, that's, it's a biblical principle, and I want to honor God. And all that was very surprising to me. But because I was interested in her, I started to become interested in pursuing what is Christianity? Who is Jesus? I just knew as a Jew growing up, not every Jew, but most Jews, especially in America, are told not to believe in Jesus. And I wasn't really told why. That's just kind of what I was told. Yeah. And I started to pursue Christianity, started reading the Bible, started reading books about the Bible. And then there was an incident that happened about a year later when I was working in Detroit. My wife was with me. We were engaged at the time. We got engaged right after we moved to Detroit. I ran into an old friend by the name of Scott Hansen. Scott works for NFL Network.
Sure.
Scott was a friend at Syracuse, and we used to run together. And Scott had totally changed. He no longer was the party guy. He had this calm demeanor about him. Scott had become a Christian. And so now Scott was witnessing to me. My fiance was witnessing to me. And as I started to do research, I'm very skeptical by nature. So I started to read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, books by Josh McDowell, started reading commentary after commentary about the Bible. I became intellectually convinced in Jesus Christ. But I still hadn't gone there, I think, fully. My heart still was not committed. So I would go to church, but really my life was not representative of a Christ-centered life. I still was doing a lot of the same things, a lot of the same traps and sins that I was involved in, I still would be involved in. And then in the late 90s, I was off doing a game, and I read a book that I don't want to say the name of it because it's not really a book theologically I believe in, but it scared me a lot. And it got me to a point where I got down on my knees in a hotel room and confessed and repented of my sin. And when we moved to Phoenix in 2002, I got baptized and have been following Christ the best I can ever since. So that kind of in a nutshell is my testimony.
No, I think we can go a little deeper. There's a lot there. I guess the first question I'll ask is, how did your family take to you converting to Christianity from Judaism? How was that conversation? What was that like, just from that perspective?
Well, man, I wish I could go back, Jason, and change the way I handle things. And I would say that about a lot of relationships. I was an in-your-face, on fire, beat you over the head with a Bible type of Christian. Yeah. The wrong way to handle it. And I did that with my family. It was basically, I was saying, you're wrong and I'm right. And they resisted, they pushed back. And really, I still have a good relationship with my parents, but I probably lost the right to witness to them based on how I handled it. And so we just don't have conversations anymore. I do have, there was another young man that I grew up with who was Jewish as well. He became a Christian. His parents disowned him. So thankfully, my parents didn't do that, although my actions and the way I handled it, I wouldn't have been shocked looking back if they disowned me. So I still have a good relationship with them, but unfortunately I handled it so poorly, and did that in a lot of other relationships too, as a young believer.
You mentioned your wife when you first met her. Kind of, the Bible wasn't the inherent authority, but she was walking with the Lord. So were you guys kind of walking this journey together in growing in Christ, even though she had been a Christian prior?
In a lot of ways, yes.
Yeah.
She grew up pretty much in a single family home. Her father was not around, basically abandoned her and her mother and her sister. And so, her mom was doing the best she could, working several jobs. Her mom was a Christian. And so she was exposed to Christianity and exposed to doing, I guess, living biblically in certain areas, but there are other areas of her life where, she wasn't. Part of that was just not knowing because she wasn't in the Word. And I think when she saw that I was committed, I think, she had already committed, but I think when she saw my commitment, that inspired her. And I think God working in both of our lives there to bring us closer together, to grow together. And we both were baptized together at the same time in the church here in Chandler in 2002, and committed to raise our kids, as believers. And so, I would say that, it was something that we, did together.
We'll have more of our conversation with Dave Pasch, radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals and ESPN broadcaster, in just a moment, but want to take a minute to tell you about Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Listen, this is a wonderful thing that Compassion does, where you can make a difference one child at a time by sponsoring them through Compassion. You go to their website, go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. That's the website that you can go to through the Sports Spectrum promotion, and you get to pick a child. Look at all the children that are looking for a sponsor, and you can pray about it, kind of maybe match it to your children, maybe you have a daughter or a son that's 7, 8, 9 years old. Well, you can find a child that's also 7, 8, 9 years old and match it. And then what you can do is have your child write to your child that you sponsor, which is really cool. My daughter has done that, and she's written letters and kind of back and forth, almost like a pen pal with the child that you sponsor. We sponsor now a 13-year-old boy from Haiti. And I'm telling you, it's the best $38 that we spend every single month. So go to compassion.com, release a child from poverty. You can make the difference. Compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. Now back to our conversation with Dave Pasch, ESPN broadcaster, right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. We're talking to Dave Pasch here, ESPN broadcaster and radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And Dave, our walks with the Lord sort of parallel quite a bit, actually. I came to faith in 2001 myself during my early years at ESPN, was baptized in 2002. And I remember having to figure out what I believe and then navigating through that with my work each day. For you, tell me about how coming to faith in Christ affected the broadcasting work that you were doing. Did those two intersect at all?
No, it did intersect, and there was a point where I was like, well, if I'm a Christian, maybe I need to be a pastor. Maybe I shouldn't be, a broadcaster. Why am I doing this other thing here that really has no impact on anybody? Is how I viewed it at the time, and go into ministry. And I think then as I started to grow and started to develop friendships and relationships with people that didn't see things the way I did, I started realizing, maybe I can actually be used here in this job, and obviously as I grew and matured, realized, well, that's how it works. You have, God puts you in a job, part of, and that's your ministry. And so, I think once I kind of embraced that, I actually began to enjoy broadcasting more because I was, developing deep friendships and relationships with people and being respectful of their beliefs and having healthy conversations while doing my job. And I think too, I started to appreciate what I was doing more. I think, early on, you mentioned when I was at Syracuse, I thought, I get out of college and go to CBS or ESPN right away. I had this huge ego, and look, I fight the ego every day. I think we all do. But, I think I became more thankful. I became more appreciative of what I was doing. But there were some times as I was growing, and I saw, first of all, I had a really foul mouth. I used to swear. If you watch Goodfellas, that had nothing on me. Yeah. I was far worse than Joe Pesci's character. But what was really interesting, that had changed. It just stopped when I became a Christian. It just, it doesn't mean it never happened again, but it just kind of stopped. But it was interesting as I started to just see. I started to see things and notice things that I used to see in myself and other people. And it just was really interesting to kind of see, you're almost seeing yourself grow and transform and change. And it was kind of strange at first. But, I think always hopefully for all of us, when we, are maturing in Christ and doing our job, that we see the two intersect, because I think that's what God wants from us. He wants us to be involved. He loves people. He wants us to be involved in people's lives and use the position, the platform that He's given us to do what we're supposed to do for Him.
Yeah, and obviously you're not hired, with the job that you're doing now and any of the jobs that you're doing to be a preacher. Neither was I.
Right.
But as followers of Christ, it's important for us, as it says in 1 Peter, to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that's in us. Is there a story where you might be able to share, obviously not naming names if you don't want to, of a time and maybe you found yourself having discussions with a colleague or someone about faith, or they were asking you, why don't you curse, or why don't you do this, or not that it's a legalistic faith that we live, but just standing out, and being a little different or not partaking in certain things. Is there conversations of faith maybe that took place in your realm of broadcasting?
Yeah, there's been a lot over the years. Some have been, some I initiated, some others initiated. I've just tried to, Chris Spielman, who's a good friend who worked at ESPN for a long time, had a great way of handling himself where, you're sharing, you're not stuffing. If somebody asks you, you share. You just ask questions about them. He just had a great demeanor about himself. And, I mentioned early on, and as I was a believer, I kind of hit people over the head with the Bible. And that's, that's not how we're supposed to be.
Right.
That's not, being a good witness. And I learned about sharing and asking questions. And, I think after, this was a few years ago, when obviously a lot of people talked about it, when, Bill on the air gave me the Charles Darwin book, and
yeah, I remember that.
I said I didn't believe in evolution, and it's not like you have this. I got ripped obviously by a lot of people, but it's not like you have this forum to say, well, here's what I believe, right? You don't have, it's in the middle of a college basketball game. You don't have a 5 or 10 minutes to explain yourself,
right.
And the differences between micro and macro evolution, right? And what is what we believe as opposed to maybe what Darwin believes.
Right.
But anyway, I think after that, a lot of people thought I was going to be upset with Bill, with our producer, and I wasn't. In fact, I think my relationship probably got better with everybody after that. I think part of it was I wasn't upset, I wasn't mad, and I think they were surprised a little bit. I did get that sense in talking to one of the people that I work with. I won't name names, but
yeah.
He was surprised that I wasn't mad or that I didn't strike back, or I just kind of looked at it as in fun. And I actually had, there were people calling like, hey, we want to have you come to our church and talk. Whoa. This isn't about me versus anybody. This was, first of all, it was a fun bit. It was unexpected. It was spontaneous. I didn't expect it. My reaction was real. It was just because I didn't know what was coming. But, I'm not out to make enemies here. This was, why can't we have healthy conversations? Why can't we just disagree? Why do we have to make everything individual versus individual?
Yeah, us against them, right?
Yeah. So yeah. I just try to be gracious and move on. And I think that it did allow me. I had some conversations with some people after, and I had a chance to share my faith in a non-confrontational way that was healthy. And then I could ask questions about them and listen to them and their story. But I think that, and maybe just how things went down, it wasn't planned. I didn't try to handle it a certain way. It wasn't calculated. But it did open a door to be able to share a little bit.
And it's funny because there's such a stigma, I think, from through social media of us against them, and just how in the culture of where we live in today, not just from a Christian perspective, but just from a worldly perspective, that we want to scream and shout and yell. And yet it comes down to, like you just kind of mentioned, and especially for believers, to just start having conversations with people, right?
Yeah, I think, as I've grown and as a Christian, I think the biggest mistake we make as believers is we always have our boxing gloves on. Why can't we just love people? Why can't we just have conversations with people that we might disagree with, that we may not see eye to eye on political issues or social issues? Why are we always looking for a fight? Just love people. Just love them. Be friends with them. If that leads to conversations and there's an opportunity to have a discussion about what you believe or what they believe, that's great. And but yeah, I think we make a mistake, and sometimes we make Christianity look something that is unappealing to others because we make it seem like it's about us, that we're righteous, that and we come off that way. We come off self-righteous.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to be looking at ourselves. Too many Christians, and I've been guilty in the past of doing it, we want to blame everybody else for things we don't like. We need to look at ourselves. I mean, ultimately, we need to police ourselves. And I think the best way we can do that is reaching out to people and loving them, caring for them, showing that we care. Doing that, you'll earn a right to be able to tell people what you believe. But, it's hard to earn that right if you don't treat people with respect and honor.
Man, that is the truth. We're talking to Dave Pasch here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. A couple more questions. I want to go back into your job for a second because it's July. We're taping this interview, and it's about to get crazy, as it does every year for you, because you're not just doing work for ESPN, which maybe from the national perspective everybody sees, college football, college basketball, NBA, but also the radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals. So I'm fascinated to kind of know, once September comes, I have to imagine it's just nonstop crazy until basketball is over. Can you take us through your schedule a little bit once football starts back up and kind of just what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah, it's weird. You go from 100 miles an hour to a full stop. I'm off right now. And so,
Yeah.
you almost feel like you're unemployed. I mean, you're in the house, the kids are doing their normal thing. Your wife's moving around and you're just kind of in the way, searching for something to do. I tweeted something the other day and Luganbill and McElroy, who I work with on college football, texted me like, boy, Dave's bored. It's true. You try to keep yourself occupied, and once August hits, you start getting a little taste because you're doing preseason games, you're at training camp. And then once, September hits, every Saturday you're doing a college football game. And then you're racing to the airport to meet the Cardinals either back here in Arizona or where they are. And then if they're on the road, you fly back on the team plane. And then once you hit, October now, basketball. So you might have a Wednesday where you have an NBA game. You may have a Tuesday where you have a college basketball game in November, December, and then you still have your college football and your NFL. So it gets, November, December, January, those in March, those are usually the craziest months because obviously in November, December, you've got 4 sports going on in a given week. And so it's, just managing it and keeping it straight. And, it's fun. I enjoy it. It'd be one thing if you didn't like it, but I enjoy it and kind of feed off the adrenaline of doing all of it and being prepared and working with different analysts.
Is it difficult? I'm putting on my broadcasting hat, I guess, right now. Is it just difficult to prepare for, let's pretend it's 3 or 4 broadcasts in a week, but even 2 football games, on a Saturday college football game and then a Sunday NFL game, even if it is the team that you're the voice of with the Cardinals, you still have to prepare to be ready for these games. Is that hard to kind of put them both, or have you figured out, sort of a structure that works for you?
I think I've been doing the double since 2004. So, it's 15 years. I think I've got a pretty good feel for kind of managing the prep. College football, you won't prep harder for any other sport than college football because, each week you're getting a new team. Maybe it's a team you haven't seen before. And now you got to do all this catch-up work on reading the clips and learning about certain players. And a lot of times you're calling games where the players don't have names on the back of their jerseys or their numbers are hard to read. I mean, so you've got to kind of just get a feel for that team. The NFL, you're doing, one of the teams, the other team, you probably know the key players, obviously. And radio is different because in TV, obviously, you're doing more storytelling. You have a producer, you have a production team. And in radio, it's just kind of you and the analyst. And the analyst, the analyst in TV is involved more than the analyst on radio because there's just not a lot of time. Because in radio, you're calling the game. You're doing play-by-play. You're setting up the play. You're calling the play. You're finishing the play. You don't have a lot of time for other stuff. So the prep work, you're still doing prep work, obviously, but it's not the same as it is for a college football game. And then basketball, sure. I mean, there again, is the prep of making sure you know all the stories about each team or each school. The prep with a game with Bill is different. I'm not doing the same amount of prep with Bill because I just know we're not going to go down that road. We're going to end up talking about some things not involved with.
Exactly. Yeah, that's funny. Now, I wonder for you, because you're also a husband and a dad to 3 kids, how have you been able to kind of, because you obviously we're called to love our wives and to love our kids and stay present in their lives. How do you do that and still kind of have this crazy schedule for those months? Or is it kind of understood that, dad's just going to be, that's this time of year because of the schedule and the way that it's set up for you?
Yeah, I mean, first, my wife's awesome. She is so supportive. It doesn't mean that there haven't been times where she's frustrated with the amount of time that I'm gone during the year. And there's some times where I don't want to be gone. It's hard. It's just something that you work through as a couple. But I think it started with, her giving me the okay to go into this business. I mean, we had a conversation very early on about, we moved a bunch the first few years from, again, Morgantown to Detroit to Chicago, then back to Syracuse for 3 years, and then to Phoenix. And we've been here now, for, 16, 17 years. But my kids, my oldest is 20 and, it's really everything she's known. So she was like 5 years old when I started at ESPN. So it's really, it's just what they've known. It's what they're used to. It doesn't mean they always like it, but it's what they're used to. And it sometimes can be a challenge for me of making sure that you are getting in your quiet time. You're focused on the things you need to be focused on. You're spending time with other people, and with all the travel obviously is the hardest part. It's making sure you're taking care of yourself so that you can be at your best for your employer. So it's a great job. But certainly the challenges of trying to make sure that you're a present father and that you're being part of their lives, and staying connected with your wife even when you're thousands of miles away sometimes.
What about staying spiritually fed? I talk to a lot of athletes on this podcast, and they talk about Bible studies during the season and things that they're a part of. Obviously, going to a church regularly becomes very difficult, especially with games on Sunday, traveling, all of that. So I wonder for you during the season, how do you stay fed spiritually? That's got to be a discipline I have to imagine you've had to figure out as well.
Yeah, this may be a lengthy answer. Hopefully, I'm not taking up too much of the time here. But yeah, one of the things it's probably, and I don't mean this like I'm not trying to take this mantle upon myself here, but I do think it's a blessing and a curse. One of the things I mentioned when I became a believer, I did a lot of research, and when I was thinking about becoming a believer, and then when I became a believer, I did even more. And I really, because I'm Jewish, I really wanted to understand the Old Testament better and to have a better way of communicating to people certain things in the Old Testament that they may find confusing or in conflict with other scriptures, whether it was helping believers or helping non-believers. And then thankfully I've been able to teach a class at our church about Old Testament theology. And so theology and reading the Bible, that's easy for me. Unfortunately, sometimes it's at a point sometimes where you've read it all and you've read so much of it that you need to get fed in a different way. And that has been a struggle for me sometimes, is finding a way to get fed in my heart, because I can read all I want and have as much knowledge as I want to have, but ultimately it's how we apply it. And that's where the heart comes in. And so it's listening to podcasts, reading the scripture, but praying as you read it sometimes helps. But that's a struggle for me. I have my partner on the Cardinal games, Ron Wolfley's a believer. He and I, we do every season before the season starts, we go down to one of the prisons and do prison ministry. And that is something that feeds my spirit. And then on the road together, we'll do Bible studies with some other guys. So I think I'm still discovering how to get fed on the road, because a lot of times when I read the scripture, I just you have a tendency to get bored sometimes because you've read it before. So it's, how do I read this in a new way where I'm submitted and listening and allowing it to enter my heart and not just enter my head? And that's still a challenge for me.
A couple more questions here with Dave Pasch. On your Twitter page, it lists Matthew 6:33 there, and I love that verse. But I'm wondering if you could just read that verse, tell us what the verse is, and then maybe share why you have that specific verse on your page and what it means to you.
Sure. Seek the kingdom first and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And actually added that recently. For forever, I had John 1:14 was about the Word becoming flesh, and I thought that was a great scripture to have on there in case somebody asked me about it. The reason I changed it because I think it's a struggle for all of us. I'm no different. I think there are times I don't seek the kingdom first. In that passage, Jesus obviously talks about all the areas of human life that we can focus on. Not that those things are bad in and of themselves, but we can idolize them and spend so much time about focusing on other things and not really seeking God. And that is an easy thing to do. So it's a reminder for me about seek God first, and all these things will be added unto you. Not meaning, if you seek God first, he's going to bless you with this and bless you with that. But it's just, these things will take care of themselves. They'll no longer become so important, because the next verse talks about not worrying. And, worry is something I struggle with. I think, a lot of believers, we do. We trust God, but we still struggle trusting God because we're human. And our default is to not trust. Our default is to trust in ourselves and try to figure things out ourselves. I think sometimes, especially as guys, we try to fix everything. And so I put that there to remind myself as much as anything that, hey, if I'm going to have this verse up here, I better do it myself. If I'm going to talk to somebody about my faith, I better be doing it myself. I better be not hypocritical here. So it reminds me to seek God first and His righteousness, doing things the right way, and not doing things my way, which all too often I struggle with and sometimes fail at.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's close it with this, Dave. And we ask this to all of our guests here on the podcast. In the season that you're in right now, you're getting ready to go back to another season of football and kind of the chaos and craziness of work. But right now, where the Lord has you, what are you learning from Him? What's He been teaching you during this time in your life?
Wow. Well, we just had, it's been an interesting 18 months. My wife is very involved in a ministry, or was very involved in a ministry called Young Lives.
Sure.
Which helps single moms. And we had known a woman, since she's now 24, since she was 14 years old when she had her daughter, Cassandra. And about a year and a half ago, my wife got a call from this woman, Carmen, that she had gotten in a felony DUI, had been addicted to meth, and basically was on the brink of suicide, and was without hope, and was reaching out to her kind of for any sort of help. My wife came to me and said, "How would you feel about Carmen moving in with us?" And I, at first, absolutely rejected the idea, and said, "Well, what about my kids? This is dangerous." And a year and a half later, she has been sober for a year. I think there have been a couple incidents. Cassandra went to our kids' school this past year. She's 9 years old. They just moved out. Unfortunately, we actually have not heard from them. We're a little concerned right now, so it's kind of an ongoing thing. Mm-hmm. So if you're listening to this and you're a prayerful person, please pray for Carmen and Cassandra, because we don't know what's going on. But in terms of, I think God taught me about being out of your comfort zone. When you have someone else and their child living with you, it stretches you. And, sometimes we want the things that we go with, we want things to be easy. And, I think sometimes doing the hard thing, if we just do the hard thing, that's usually the right thing. Yeah. That was a hard thing. It was a hard thing to open your home to someone who had been struggling with drugs and alcohol, and goes back to trusting God, right? Trusting that God has provided this opportunity for you to use a home that God has blessed us with, use a life that God has blessed us with, and share it with somebody. Share it with basically somebody you don't know. And watching how their lives have been transformed, not because of us. I didn't do anything. How God has transformed them. Both of them have been baptized, and just watching their walk with Christ has been amazing. Like I said, we're a little concerned right now because we have not had contact, but a year and a half ago, again, I just probably would have moved on. I wouldn't be, okay, we don't know them that well. So, but now you're invested, because you let go of being selfish, and you said, I'm going to do something for someone else, because ultimately that's the best witness. I mean, if we're Christians, we should be doing that every day. I just felt God saying to us, I provided you with this here. This is the opportunity to be this is your mission trip. You're inviting two people into your home. And taking a chance. It hasn't, been easy at times, but, having the opportunity to have an impact on two lives that, who knows where they would be without any sort of stability, it really stretched me. And hopefully it means that there'll be another opportunity, and that I won't be so stubborn that I'll be more accepting right away. I think there was part of me that was about protecting my family and making sure that we're not getting ourselves in a situation that could be dangerous for us. But we knew Carmen, and had a feeling that she had really hit rock bottom, and that she was really seeking out. And obviously we laid down some rules, no cell phone, and other things. she agreed to those rules. And it was amazing to watch our kids see them, interact with them, build a relationship with them, and us as well. And, fall in love with a 9-year-old girl who's not your own.
Yeah.
So it was, I didn't mean to take up so much time, but it just, again, was more about watching their growth. And they inspired me because, I haven't had to go through what they've been through. And so it really inspired me to be more open, be less selfish, and again, just love people. Just love them. People that don't look the same as you, people that don't think the same as you, people that don't make decisions that you would make. What harm in there is loving them, reaching out to them, sharing with them, opening your home to them, and allowing God to do his thing and getting out of the way. That's what he taught me. I wish, I could do it more. I wish that there'd be other opportunities to do that, because there was a joy in that. There was a peace in that you can't just manufacture on your own.
Sometimes our greatest mission field is right in front of us and we don't even realize it. People going all over the world, and that's great. The work in Africa and China and different places and these other countries, and yet it's right in front of us sometimes every single day, and sometimes every Sunday morning when we just walk into church building. We could go on and on, Dave, but I want to be respectful to your time, and maybe we'll just have you back on next year after this season's over, and we can kind of rehash what the last year's been like. But this has been a lot of fun getting to know you, and I do appreciate your heart and your transparency here, because sometimes it's not easy to be that way. But I can tell God is doing some awesome things in your life, and just appreciate you sharing from your heart and sharing your story, and wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I appreciate you having me on very much, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity.
And we do thank Dave Pasch, ESPN broadcaster and radio voice of the Arizona Cardinals, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I really enjoyed listening to Dave's story, Dave's journey, both through broadcasting, meeting his wife, and then his conversion to Christianity and following Jesus. It was really neat to hear his transparency in that, because, as Dave said, he's a skeptic by nature. And growing up Jewish, he had heard about Jesus, but really told not to follow him, that he wasn't who he says he was. Dave did the investigation. Dave read The Case for Christ from Lee Strobel and really researched what Jesus and who Jesus was, whether it was fact or just a fable. And he came to the conclusion, as many of us have, including myself, that Jesus was real, that he walked this earth, and that he was who he says he was, which is the Messiah, the one who came to die for our sins. And grateful for Dave for sharing that story. Loved his broadcast journey, just as a broadcasting guy myself. I loved hearing that. But then at the end, he shared the story about Carmen and Cassandra. And you could tell that was fresh when Dave shared that, because Carmen and Cassandra were a mom and a daughter that he and his wife and his family had welcomed into their home. And they were struggling and recovering from addiction, alcohol, meth addict, and had gained full sobriety. And Dave shared on the podcast that they had decided to move, left a note, and then kind of went missing. And they hadn't heard from them in a week or so. Dave asked for prayers on the podcast, and I was going to pray. I actually recorded a version of this close with me praying, and we should still pray for them. But then the next day, Dave shared on Twitter a little update. So I'll just read that to you. And it says, "Thank you for all your prayers. We found them, spoke with them in person, and they appear to be safe and sober," talking about Carmen and Cassandra. "We don't know if they will stay in touch, but at least they know they're loved and treasured." That's on Twitter from @DavePasch, Dave sharing that story on his Twitter page. And we're glad that they were found. We're glad that they're at least okay, and what appears to be okay. We hope that they can reconcile with Dave and his family, but either way, we're glad that they're found and that they're safe, and that's really, really good news. So thanks to Dave for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. We also thank you, and we thank our partners at Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportsspectrum, $38 a month. Sponsor a child, provide hope for a child, provide a future for a child in need. 150,000 children have chosen to follow Christ in the last year alone through Compassion. And listen, we all have charities that we help give to. We all have, obviously, you should be giving to your local church and tithing there. And of course, we all have places that we want to spend our money. I'm telling you, $38 for 1 month. It's like a cable bill, basically, actually a lot less than a cable bill. And what you're doing is you're connecting directly to a child in need across the world. And you're providing them with hope, with money, with food, with clothing, with everything that they need. Their essential needs. You're doing that with Compassion International for $38 a month. I promise you, you won't regret spending that $38 and providing hope for this child. It's really a great, great thing. We're so proud to be involved with it. My wife, my daughter, myself, sponsoring a 13-year-old boy from Haiti, and we want to encourage you to get involved as well. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Sponsor a child today. I promise you, you won't regret it. $38 a month. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. Thanks so much for joining us. Email me, jason@sportspectrum.com. You can go to our Twitter page or our Facebook page, our Instagram page. Follow us there. Let us know that you heard the podcast. We'll be happy to retweet you and send you a note of thanks. We appreciate you listening to the Sports Spectrum podcast and being a part of all that we're doing here at Sports Spectrum. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast.